So how are you today, Ed?
Well, not the worse for wear. Things are a bit hectic around here these days. I have the daughter and the twins and the grandson up for 2 weeks. So that was a bit of a challenge because I had more grandpa duty than usual, more cooking duty than usual.
Was it kind of a summer thing, end of summer
Yeah,
vacation?
yeah. The grandson had vacation from kindergarten, so we didn't want to keep him in the house for 2 weeks and brought him up here. He can roam around a little bit. We live out in the country. They live in the city. It's a city mouse, country mouse kind of thing.
Uh-huh. Well, that's good. It's good for them,
No, it is. It
I
is.
imagine.
They get out, they get to see something different. He gets to see something different for whatever. And then he gets together with his 2-year-old cousin. And then one's in the terrible twos, and the other one goes, well, if he can do it, I can too. So,
Oh, permission to regress.
yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, it was a real. It's an interesting experience watching kids unfold. You know, just I'm absolutely amazed that we make sense of anything ever. Yeah, because we start with.
Can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, John.
Okay,
No,
I'm having trouble with something. Thank you.
okay, all right. But
I'll try to fix it.
if it's only technological, you're way ahead of the rest of us.
No? No?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yeah, I hear you. I heard
Can
you.
you-
I heard you. I heard
Thank you. I think I fixed it. Thanks so much.
Okay. All right.
Caroline, welcome,
Caroline.
Caroline. And Lucy's here. I can't see her, but I think she's
Can't see
unmuted.
her. She's muted, but she's here.
And I know Doug will not be joining us,
Yeah, he said he wasn't going to come.
and I'm not sure if anybody else said they would, so it might, maybe, just us.
So are we going to start? And maybe when other people join us, we can just open our hearts and minds to their presence and welcome them. I think that would be great.
Sounds like a plan.
Where should we start, gang? Where would you like? Oh, Lucy. Lucy, can you unmute? I can't. I don't know if Lucy's responding.
Hi,
Oh,
hi.
hi, Lucy. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
We can't see you, but I can hear you fine.
Hi.
Now I can see you. Good to. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. I'm yeah. Sorry, running a bit late, so I'm just drying my hair.
Very important.
Yeah. So, how are you, John?
Great. I think I know everybody here. I don't know if everyone here, though, knows everybody else. So I don't know if we want to do a round of intros very quickly. Lucy and I are acquainted through the Bateson conversation, 20 episodes, I believe. So we know each other pretty well from that. And I think I think everyone else knows each other pretty well. So anyway, chime in wherever you guys want to start. I'm wide open.
Well, I know of Lucy, and I saw one of the Bateson videos where you give some of an introduction, and I know that you are well, you can tell me that you're a scholar, a researcher, that you have an interest in consciousness studies. Broadly speaking, I know that the language that we use for these things is part of what is up for discussion. But it's very nice to meet you, and I look forward to staying with the trouble together, to being with, and I'm all over the site, so I don't think I need to introduce myself too much, but I'm one of the co-instigators of this cafe, and try to make it here when I can.
Yeah, I don't think we've met before, Lucy. My name, Acronon, is what's up there. It's my handle, but everybody calls me Ed. I've looked in on a lot of the conversations. I'm generally here every Tuesday evening, regardless of what's going on, just because it seems like a nice thing to do. Also, I'm pretty interested in Gape, so that's how I got hooked up to Infinite Conversations. That was the reading back in 16, I guess it was. So that's how I showed up. That's kind of the vantage point that I approach things from. I'm also rather curmudgeon-y at times, so you'll just have to bear with me on that one. It's old habits die hard.
We've tamed them a little, though.
Yeah, I know. You guys do a good job of that.
Sorry, Ed, did you say it was Bateson that you were interested in?
I read Bateson in parallel to what you folks did. I just didn't participate in any of the discussions because the timing is, I'm in Germany. So showing up is sometimes difficult because everybody there has to do things during the day. And for me, it's kind of the evening. Even though I'm retired, my time's not my own. So I don't actually have a schedule. I can just do whatever I want or listen to recordings whenever it pleases me. So I didn't get to follow along on the discussion, but I was reading along with the rest of you because I was interested in what Bateson had to say. I particularly liked what Nora had to say, actually more than what Gregory did, but that's another issue.
Caroline, have you spoken yet?
No,
Yes.
I haven't. Hi, I'm
Welcome.
Caroline. Thank you. Nice to meet you, Lucy. I know everyone else here, and it's good to see you. I haven't seen some of you in a while. This is my first cafe in a long time. And I'm actually really looking forward to reading this book, Staying with the Trouble, after I read the introduction today. Yeah, I think Donna Haraway and Bateson and these folks have very much influenced me, although at the moment indirectly, because I haven't directly come into too much contact with their work, just a little bit about Donna Haraway's article about cyborgs. Like 10 years ago I read that, but that's about my only direct known contact to these topics. But I have a feeling that there's a lot of interconnections, perhaps not on the discrete level, but like more on the consciousness level of what they're doing and what I'm trying to do. So yeah, I really liked Haraway's language in this introduction about all the like messy connections as a means to move forward. That's how I feel in general. So hello, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I'll just do a kind of brief intro, I guess. Caroline, what you said about messy connections made me think. Well, at the moment, I'm actually not in London. I'm away for a few months, having a break from London, and I'm in. At the moment, I'm in Dublin, and I had a meeting. The first person I arranged to have a meeting with in Dublin. Thinking of messy connections, we sat down. She took a book out of her bag and said, "Oh, I think you'd really like this book." I was given it for my birthday last week, and it was the Nora Bateson book. And it was sort of felt like this really nice kind of coming together of sort of quite appropriate way of all these things sort of coming together for me. But that aside, yeah, I'm normally based in London, currently in Dublin. For a month, and then going elsewhere for a bit before coming back to London. Yeah, I'm a PhD student in the art department. So I'm a curator of art ordinarily. I have run a gallery for a really long time, although I don't currently do that, but for about 10 years I've run different spaces. And I run a research group called Wet Rest, which is a research and reading group, kind of like a practice-based research group that uses sensory deprivation and flotation as a kind of methodology for artistic research. So that's kind of quite central to my PhD at the moment. But generally, yeah, I have an interest in cybernetics and obviously art practice and Donna Haraway, although I haven't actually read all of this book yet. So yeah, and the connection between Donna Haraway and Bateson is interesting as well. So I think there's lots to talk about sort of between the Bateson, sort of coming off the back of the Bateson discussions and coming into Haraway discussion. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that too, Lucy. Getting a chance to reconnect with Nora and Gregory and Donna Haraway. I'm a big fan of hers. I haven't read all of her books, but I have all of them. And I've read most of some of them, and I move around. And I think that she continues to fascinate me. And I've also watched lots of her interviews, and she has a lot of YouTube presentations. She's quite a character. And I think her use of stories in Staying with the Trouble is very intriguing. I had a very allergic reaction to the last part of the book where she actually imagines an alternate future. It's not an alternate future that I'm very interested in. But I do find some of the stories that she offers in another book, When Species Meet, extremely compelling. And I think it's because some of these stories are so close to home. She's actually talking about her relationship to her pets, or what she would call her companions, and her family, her biological family. And I find her first-person accounts of her relationship to her father, who was crippled by tuberculosis and who had to walk around with crutches. And her observation of this as a young girl, and her growing relationship with her father's intellect. And I just want to quote her briefly from this book. I hope it is of use to our discussion, because I think she's really talking about storytelling. And that's a passion for many of us here. Stories, what kind of stories? Where do our stories come from? Co-creating a more multiphasic culture, rather than just dealing with, a very thin layer of the neocortex, that cognitive capacity we vibrate to. It's very fast, with the slower rhythms that we get in fantasy and reverie and altered states of consciousness, drug experiences. I think, Lucy, you mentioned those tanks. What do you call them? Yeah. There's been a lot of research done with deprivation, sensory deprivation, various kinds of athletics and dance and music and art, creating these a multiphasic culture where other phases of consciousness are allowed. And I think that's what I think her challenge is. I don't think she succeeds particularly well in this last part of this Staying with the Trouble in creating a compelling alternative future. But I think she didn't intend to. I think she admits, this is a rehearsal, guys, help me out. This is a collaborative effort. And, but I think that I have such a negative response to it is actually something I think she would approve of. Because we should respond viscerally to no, that doesn't work for me. And we need to articulate that as best we can in a collaborative way, so that I think we could be then creating from a more multiphasic, healthy multiphasic culture. I'm just gonna just quote her briefly, talking about her father. She says, I noticed that my two brothers, both my older brother, Bill, and my younger brother, Rick, neither of whom had hip disorders of any kind, walked a lot like my father. They still do, even if you know what to look for. They literally embodied the gait of this man. This fact was not much remarked in the family. After all, it was normal for sons to be like their fathers, wasn't it? Theirs was a mimetic looping through the storied masculine bodies of fathers and sons, which at no point was regarded as mimicking the disability or any sort of oddity. The term disability didn't enter the family, not because there was denial about the need for crutches, but because these objects were normal parts of paternal equipment, all meanings intended. Certainly, they were part of the reproductive apparatus that shaped the bodies of my brothers. This shared gait was coming into cognizance of in regards to our father's body in a life-shaping way. In a sense, Dad's crutches symbiotically infused the bodies of all the family. My brothers and I would naturally borrow his crutches to try them out and see how fast we could go. We all did things like that, but only my brothers literally walked my father's walk. I did not have my father's gait. I had his way with language. Her father was a very accomplished sports writer. And so I find this a very grounded set of observations made from the adult after her father's passed away at this point. So it's like a memoir of her father in this portion of the text. And I think that it's it's very grounded and very good observations about how her brothers took on that gait of the father, but that she did not. She modeled, in a way, other aspects of her relationship to her father, like her father's use of language. And I'm wondering if that's always inevitable, that the sins of the fathers or the disabilities of the fathers will be inevitably picked up on by the sons. I don't think that's inevitable at all. I think there are some sons, like myself, who had a very dysfunctional family and a very fucked up father, by everyone's account. I said, no, I am not going to do what he did to my mother. I will not do what he did to my brothers. I'm not going to do what he did. So there was a strong reaction against his that kind of inheritance. I don't know how successful I've been. There are certainly influences of his that I am able to register in my own behavior and in my relationships with others. I often find those influences something that I want to self-correct for. And I think that's our challenge as we move forward and as we collect stories from our friends and our neighbors and from the press and from politicians. What are we going to carry forward? And I think that she does a splendid job in what I've read so far. From this book is about her animals, actually. And they're very grounded stories. But I find her use of the future extremely abstract. And she moves towards a third person account, sort of an omniscient narrator, sort of coming from nowhere, who's tracking the lives of her characters. But it says extremely, the characters are not well shaped or realized. So the environment that she's trying to describe them, trying to create an organization from, seems to me basically just a reprise of all the things that don't work very well right now, like genetics, for instance. And this will be very briefly is all I'm going to say. And then I'll pass on the torch to it, or the microphone, or whatever, to anyone else who wants to respond. I hope I can find this quote. Anyway, but it's in the story. I'll look it up. But there's something I find very chilling about her future community using genetics to transfer the animal genetics, the animal genes, to implant them small amounts in human children so that they will have a better rapport with those animals. But she says it does not go in the other direction. The human genome does not go in, human genes are not implanted into the animal. I think this is a kind of strange anti-human post-humanism. And I think it's just a reprise of the same kind of control and predict procedures that are already pretty much in place, that many of us are revolted by. Anyway, I'm just sharing that because I think her futurizing is necessary and insufficient. I don't think her story mobilizes me very much. She's also talking about the reduction of the human population to about 1 billion. I think that's a great idea. I don't know how you're going to make that happen, though. But once again, these visionary episodes are not necessarily about implementing a plan. They're about getting our imaginations working effectively together. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there, and there are a lot of other things I could come up with because reading this book has triggered a lot of stuff, and I want to share that and hear how you guys are responding to what you've read so far, or to what's going on in your environment right now, like the fires that are, happening in the Amazon right now. Thanks.
May I just jump in really quickly? I think thank you for reading that bit from When Species, which book was it? Was When Species Meet? Yeah, okay. So I think that's an interesting thing what you were saying, because I haven't read that book actually. I've heard her speak about the contents of that, but so what you were saying about the sons taking on the limp or the way of walking of the father, that seems like the way in which close, intimate relationships, in familial relationships or friendships, are kind of your body and your kind of characteristics and your personality have these kind of porous borders where you do take on the mannerisms of people that you spend a lot of time with, and I really I was trying to find a quote while you were talking actually, from Stacey Alamo, who talks about transcorporeality as this kind of radical way of thinking of the body, as being not simply, it's like a post-human way of thinking of the body as not simply limited to the physical, corporeal, like physical boundaries. And obviously the same goes for kind of consciousness as well. I can't find a suitable quote at the moment, but she has an entry in the post-human glossary that's came out, I think, last year, that's edited by Rosie Braidotti and Maria Havlova, and her entry is on transcorporeality, and it's a really, I think it's her ideas. I mean, her writing generally is amazing, but and she often writes about these sort of ontologies where boundaries kind of dissolve, or in the face of kind of intimacy, I guess, or well, anyway, I can share some of the materials afterwards, but yeah, I think it's something that comes up a lot in Haraway and in all these kind of new materialisms, is this idea of the human, like the idea of the human exceptionalism that kind of defines a person by their physical boundaries, and the kind of separation between, obviously, humans, and other forms of being or life. And of course, this is very central to Haraway. So I was a bit rambling, sorry, but hopefully there's something useful in there.
That was great. What was the name of that author?
Stacey Alamo, Alaimo. She's written a really great text called "Your Shell on Acid," which is a text about where she's talking about the rising acidity of the oceans as a result of global warming, and how that acidity is actually physically dissolving the shells of certain types of sea creature. And she talks about this as a kind of physical, very visible manifestation of global warming, but also this kind of vulnerability and permeability of boundaries, I guess.
You mentioned transcorporeality. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have to look that. I'll have to read the book to figure that one out.
Yeah, it says. Let me just see if I can find a bit. She says, okay. Transcorporeality is not a mystical, spiritual, phenomenological, or experiential sense that everything is connected. It requires a radical rethinking of ontologies and epistemologies. It involves science, science studies, citizen science, feminist theory, environmental theories, critical race studies, disability studies, literature, art, and everyday activism. Thinking the subject as a material being subject to the agencies of the compromised, entangled world enacts an environmental posthumanism. The subject cannot be separated from networks of interactive material agencies, and thus cannot ignore the disturbing epistemological quandaries of risk society. I'm not sure what that last bit means. Yeah, maybe that's helpful.
It is helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. In the altered states, yeah, I think you mentioned dissolved boundaries creates a kind of intimacy. And I would suggest those dissolved boundaries can come from intimacy or lead to intimacy, but so can trauma. I think trauma can dissolve boundaries. And that's another story. But I think there's a relationship between intimacy, those intimate liminal zones, those liminal zones we enter into with the kind of intimacy with others who may be strangers initially, but then they're less so after that dissolution of boundaries. But sometimes there can be also trauma, can create the conditions for a kind of pseudo-intimacy. As we know the history of trauma, many children who are traumatized return to the perpetrator over and over and over again. So it becomes like an attractor. Anyway, I'm just sharing that, and I'm eager to read this book. And also, if anyone has something else that's different, I'm really open to hearing what's coming up for others. Thank you.
I'd like to share some of what's coming up for me. It was just a quick phrase that you said, John, and moved on from, but the phrase of what do we carry forward? And it stuck with me because that question, and is something that opens the book that I'm writing, which is just called Epist for now, is just as a working title to have a handle for. One of the opening parables is like, let's imagine that you are in a village that's about to be plundered by invaders, and they're burning and they're slashing and they're destroying. It's the only place you've ever known. It's your home, and you only have a few minutes to decide what you take with you as you flee into the forest to try to rewild or make a new kind of a life, an entirely new life out of what? And the question really is allegorical to, what we would want in a survival kit, so to speak, if we are trying to pass through a narrow bottleneck of survivability in the future, in the near future, in our lifetimes. What we would want is to strip down all the clutter of ideas and identities that we had because the contexts are changing so that they no longer serve. What we would want is the most generalized livability patterns, the most generalized tools, right? Bringing a tool with you in your survivability kit that like has multiple applications, right? Because you don't know what the future is going to look like. You have to be prepared for adaptation. And so one of the things that I'm reflecting on and what I'm writing about in EPIST is that I think what humans do best is generalize patterns and be able to model them in complex systems mentally before we ever even act on the world. And this moment in time, I feel, is an opportunity to appreciate the embodied wisdom of strategies and patterns that all of the living species of the world embody in terms of forms of intelligence that literally have been selected for over thousands and millions of years. That those patterns are what living works looks like. Like, to make living work, that's what it looks like. And we can, you know, at the moment that we are recognizing a dissolved boundary between ourselves and the natural world, that's an important moment, because we are saying, we're recognizing that we are all in this together, and oh, we all already have all been in this together all this time, but we forgot, right? And so there's an opportunity, I feel, to recognize and remember the kinship we have with life and with what life wants to do, what life wants to have happen here. That can be a kind of reorganizing, a very, you know, from the bottom up, self-organizing force in our world. But to even have that arise, we have to talk about it. And we also, in the moments of beginning to acknowledge just how intelligent we aren't, right? And the rest of the world, the living world is, and learning to reflect on how we, you know, appreciate that, and how connecting from this place of love, we also, you know, that also motivates us to action to preserve these embodied forms with, as though they were our own kin, right? And if their habitats are being depleted, like if they're dying, we're dying. And there's this sense of a mirroring that needs to happen. I do think that we are a lot more like life than we remember. And if we study life patterns, we can find these generalized parallels in our existence, in our societies, in our organizations, in our emotional lives, everywhere. We find these parallels everywhere. There's a lot of conversation there. And what we can do is, you know, rather than insert the genetics of an animal into our bodies, you know, like that's kind of it seems like a very strange future to me. I think a much more appropriate way of that integration is to really, again, like appreciate and generalize and deduce kind of general applications and strategic applications from living forms of all types, and really appreciating them for how they adapted to their particular contexts, and studying the contexts and studying the adaptations that trains us for a whole systems thinking mindset. And that is what humans can bring to life, can bring to capital L life, to be of benefit again to capital L life, instead of just destroying it, right? We can come back to it with offerings of what we can do really, really well. And to me, that's where the kind of the right relationship or the rapport with the diverse living world, this Cthulhu realm, as Haraway says, where we can re-enter that relationship, which we've always had, but it has been a de-emphasized aspect of ourselves because of the societies and the narratives and whatnot that we have been immersed in as of late. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to the things that we humans do really, really well. Maybe not now, but maybe later I could quiz you a little bit about what is that we really do really, really well. Because I know we do a lot of things we're really fucked up at. So anyway, thank you very much. I love that thing about mental model. We can model mentally before we actualize. And we can use our imaginations to select from an environment which is always more complex than the organism, certain features. But if we're only at a first order organization, we're only going to replicate the sins of our fathers and our mothers and what we've learned, which is dysfunctional from them. And how can we move to a second order culture? I'm just bringing this up because this has been a big theme all of us have discussed, and also a third order culture, which may be emerging. Thanks. Thank you. Oh, Marco, what was the name of that novel we studied by Octavia Butler? You were there, right?
Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents.
Yeah, I think this is very similar to the theme that Caroline is working with in her characters.
Yeah, well, I thought of Parable of the Sower when Caroline was talking as well, actually. I mean, maybe it was just in a really basic, straightforward way of what you were saying about what you take with, well, you know, what do you choose to take with you as a sort of way of building your new future. It just seems to be quite a sort of ongoing theme within Parable of the Sower, this kind of grab bag, which is always available, but it becomes this kind of, it's more than just like an object. It becomes like I don't know, like a talisman or something like that. Sorry, anyway, I didn't mean to jump in again.
I think the metaphor, no, I would love to talk about Parable of the Sower too. It's one of my favorite books that I just read a few months ago, and it changed my life. But I think the metaphor of seed and earth seed too very much fits in with that metaphor of what gets carried forward and what do we take with us. And I think a really key takeaway from Lauren, the main character, as far as how she approached it and how she develops herself. I've only read The Sower, not The Talents, but as she develops herself as well as a person, this principle of there's never a bad time to there's never like it's never a mistake. It's never a problem to learn more, to just learn as much as you can for whatever you feel attracted to learn, because you never know when that little seed of an idea, of that connection that you once had to some book you read or whatever, will come back up and be relevant and actually be relevant in the sense of like making for a more livable situation. So yeah, I think there's something about going back to Johnny's question about what do we do really, really well. There's something about our capacities, I think, to generalize and model complex interactions and design from that place that is our value. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
Hi, Michael. Welcome. Could you say repeat the last bit you said? I couldn't hear you, Caroline. What we do really, really well? Could you just?
I think what we do really, really well is modeling complexity in our own heads, which actually is why we are, in a sense. I actually could sit here and argue why humans are something life wanted to have happen. Like, I think that humans are very much an epic expression of negentropy, because we contain worlds within ourselves, and even multiple worlds, and we can model multiple worlds within ourselves, and there's 7 billion of us. I mean, that is an extension of complexity, absolutely. So if only we could come back into kind of a sense of communion and kinship or familialness, I don't know if there's a word for that, with life, we could recognize and see in the mirror of our own circumstances and our own challenges with global scale livability issues, see reflected the patterns of other living beings and see how they've survived, and look to generalize those patterns and generalize and model complex systems, and then act. Like, I think one of our most tender, incredible capacities is to act with really deep consideration of the factors at play, and act incredibly masterfully, act incredibly thoughtfully. And that, again, is something I think we as a type, as a species, can bring back to life as an offering of sorts, to say, we're sorry, we do belong here. We are part of this web, and we love life, we love ourselves, we love being here. So let's try to contribute again. Let's try to return to contributing with our talents. So those are some of my thoughts about this kind of idea of meshing or blending or losing some boundariedness, which is necessary at this moment from just the complexity of our systems. We're starting to see feedback loops that our ancestors set in motion, but we and our children are going to have to deal with. But so, it forces us to change our mental models and to move towards more whole systems thinking, inner mental models to be able to move forward productively. So I think that's, to me, that's where the losing of boundaries or kind of the blending, like that's what it could look like, is more of a, from an inside out sense of kinship with all that happens, really, and with an understanding of how everything influences everything. Yeah.
I love it, Caroline. Modeling complexity. That's really cool. Thank you. Let's do it.
I have some tentacles of thought to unfurl and wave around. And I'd like to pick up, maybe just start with pointing out the obvious, kind of like the water that we're swimming in is language. And so, Caroline, your story about being in a village that's being raided and having to gather whatever belongings you can that are in sight, that are accessible, that you're going to need for whatever is going to happen next, which you don't know.
But also won't weigh you down.
Right. Good point. Obviously we're not in that actual situation right now. And that's a metaphor. That's what'd you call it? Parable? Allegory. Yeah. For the larger situation that we're in, which I think is a more historical situation. And what you're pointing out is that in a larger sense, what is happening is this: we're in the midst of a huge event. It's a great extinction event. It's a kind of potentially catastrophic, but certainly cataclysmic shifting in some of the basic parameters and boundaries of the ecology of the biome. So hots are going to get hotter and storms are going to get bigger, and there's a warping of patterns. There's a warping and a shifting, and potentially, if that kind of becomes as it is becoming a positive feedback loop, it could create very severe types of transformations that we are only imagining now, that we're only beginning to envision and beginning to kind of channel in our art and in our media and our philosophies and so forth. And so what are we carrying forward in language, like in this, in this realm that we're in, which is kind of like the intersection of science, art, philosophy, theory, activism. It's not one thing or the other. Part of what I really like about Haraway's work is that it doesn't try to be one thing or the other. It is tentacular. It does reach into into the science, into science, biology, a little bit of. I mean, she doesn't do so much physics, but here we do, and the art realms and the consciousness study realms. I mean, there's a lot that she brings. She puts on the table, and that's part of, I think, what we don't want all of that, because we have to move lightly, but we don't want to exclude anything that might be useful. And so I think, just as an operating principle, the openness, or the kind of radical openness that I think she displays and models as a thinker is really, really great. She actually is in dialogue with novelists and media, producers and scientists and biologists and philosophers, and she's actually doing it. She's modeling like how it does, how it can be done, and I think it shows in her language. Like, her language is not standard in any way. It's not standardized. It picks up what it can from where it can. Was that grammatical? Maybe not. But in order to carry something across, to convey a meaning. And she does something, she works organically, because it's not like a systematic meaning. Like SF, it just happens to be the first two letters of any number of two-word combinations that are interesting. Science fiction, speculative feminism, string figures, etc. So why not use it? Like, that's what you can do if you've picked up a little bit from everywhere and you tie it together into this one knot. Then suddenly, in those two words, you can express like all these different you can invoke these different discourses, essentially, and make gestures that you couldn't in a purely rational or self-contained system. All right, that's just by way of prelude. I feel like Donna Haraway is, as far as what we've been doing in the Café and in Cosmos and Infinite Conversations, I see her as like one of the grandparents of our culture. Like, if we're carrying something forward, this is one of the books that we're carrying forward, right? Along with Jean Gebser and Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin. Like, we've brought things into this space because they have been of value to us, or they've promised some potential value and we work through them and we pick up ideas. Seeds. The last time that I was in a academic program was probably late 90s, like 98. It was 98. And I was doing some graduate seminars. I've spoken a little bit about these. But I was really conflicted, because part of me really liked theory. Part of me really liked the intellectual milieu and the whole life on campus, and etc. And part of me was troubled. Was deeply troubled by things that I didn't understand, things that I was only first really perceiving in this, through this body. And somewhere deep inside of me, I knew that this wasn't right. Like, that what we were all doing there in those seminar halls was not connected to the reality that the world at large, that other people at large, that the history that I was learning would suggest was really happening. And I got a seed of an idea, because we were talking, I'd been reading Heidegger. I was a Heideggerian, basically. So the question of being was, very prominent. And post Heidegger, you had a whole number of people who were trying, rethinking being and crossing out being and juxtaposing being and becoming, and really trying to rethink what is our base. You can't get more basic in terms of how we talk than is. But what does that mean? And being the seed of an idea that I got, which I thought maybe someday I'll write a paper on it or a book or whatever. It was this, and it's not meant to be an objective, perfect truth. It was just meant to contain an idea. And it was being is trauma. And that, to me, the reason that comes up now is because I think if we kind of contextualize our historical situation, we are essentially living in the consequences of reactions to trauma that have been escalated to a global scale. And there's been another conversation going on around the Axial Age. The Axial Age being Karl Jasper's term for this kind of cluster of cultural productions and apparent changes, profound fundamental changes in consciousness that all occurred around 500 BC in different parts of the world. So the Confucius and Lao Tzu in China, and the Upanishads and the Vedas in India, and the birth of Greek philosophy and the idea of democracy, and all of these awakenings that happened. And what ties them all together in the idea of the Axial Age is some kind of some awakening of transcendence. The idea that humans can transcend the world and can take a perspective on life and on being that is from nowhere. That's not, it's the pure, it's either it's God or it's the pure subject. It becomes the rational consciousness, the transcendental subject. I mean, it has all these permutations through history. I mean, the purest expression, well, the purest expression is the Kant's transcendental subject. It's the consciousness that is able to purely perceive reality without any kind of entanglements, any kind of distortions, any kind of messiness. And that, I think, is what I want to posit. That sort of pure being is that this is a response to trauma, and that in the history, like, there actually was villages.
Sorry. The desire for a true being, the desire is a response to trauma? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
The creation, like the projection of a pure consciousness that's able to stand outside of the world, outside of, is not being in the world, is not being with others, is not being towards death.
Right.
Death is just pure being. That there is in that gesture, or in that kind of turning towards something that is radically other than the world, a response to trauma. This is a hypothesis. I'm just putting that out. But that the response is a kind of unconscious reaction that becomes reacted to, and you go from that village scenario, Caroline, that you described, to a city which now has walls, because you don't want to be attacked again. You don't want to have everything taken from you again, so you build walls. From there, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to space defense systems and anti-ballistic, like, automated weapon systems, and everything that I think we have built up as a species that has been so destructive to our context, to our living context, I think can be read as one long history of trauma. That's what I want to propose. And so this Cthulhu scene is that history of trauma, like, come back to us in this monstrous form of all of the calamities, all of the things that we see happening, the fires, the wars, the megastorms, the migrations, the refugee crises. All of it is coming back to us in this magnified form, because we haven't yet integrated our own history. We haven't yet integrated everything that we have done as the sins of the species, if you want to put it that way. And so what I think the real question is, like, what do we carry forward? Because this is all going to, this is a cascade. This is sort of a runaway reaction, chain reaction, right? That is going to take a course. And we who become aware of the chain reaction and the sources of it and where it leads, can, I believe, make decisions about what we carry forward. And that could be in the ideas we carry forward. It could be in the practices we carry forward, the institutions we carry forward, or the pieces of institutions that we might carry forward into whatever we might need later. And for, maybe not just for ourselves, but for our children, grandchildren, our kin children. Like, we have to, I think, imagine a future in a way for ourselves, but we can't, but we have a lot to deal with in the present. So, I think being, I'm losing my thread of thought here because I think I've said enough. But that survival kit maybe isn't one way of thinking about it. Like, what do we put in our survival kit, intellectually, spiritually, culturally, politically, in all these terms? So that's all I think. What I'll say for now.
I liked how you articulated that, Marco. I'm pretty much working on the same hypothesis myself. Only thing I would bring to the table is that reaction to the trauma that's come about, with the Axial Age, or as the species was trying to figure out what place it plays in this big cosmos. I think the Axial Age points to a place where it wasn't about trying to understand and participate. It was about to control and predict, and it ran away with this. Because shamanistically, if there was a little more shamanistic growing, we would understand that the trauma has an intelligence that we need to learn from, and that's what we're missing. We're instead of looking at trauma as a possible intelligence to helping us grow and participate, we've decided that all we want to do is react, predict, and control, and make sure it doesn't happen again. And therefore, to me, we're operating from a very intense ignorance of what the universe may be trying to help us with, because of the Axial Age. To me, was a very, and that because of the Axial Age, we've come to understand that that's not a solid metaphor. It's kind of spread out, what I understand, was where what came online as a result of agriculture and stuff, and to predict and control, was the deficient rational. And it's just, I think that's where I agree with you. This is where we may need to maybe turn, to me, it's turning back and looking at what's in the past that we haven't brought forward, or Jeremy said, retract the technology. In Gebser's term, let's retract it so that we can better use, I think, pointing to what you're saying, use what we've kind of subjugated from the past and ignored the usefulness of it. Just the simple, coming from a magic place of being filled with, in my way of languaging, a simple awe that the fact, even though this is, we're experiencing a lot of trauma and a lot of shit going on, but as I was listening to you, I've been living with this personally since I was 14 in the 60s, with the Vietnam War, with the whole tone has gotten maybe louder, but the tone is still here, if you get my drift. As trying to speak from an elder point of view, that it's gotten louder, but the tone is still in our species, to take your point.
What do you mean by tone? Can you say more about that?
The tone is that even back then, we were recognizing we've traumatized ourselves with birth rate, with war, with the way with sexism. We were challenging how certain ways of being was causing hurt to other people, traumatizing the way we got along. It wasn't language that way, but for me, I guess, it's still it has a tone of trying to deal with the trauma up until the 60s, of the way we've been through just the trauma of 2 world wars. you know, and then going into the Vietnam War and then the civil rights, that there was this traumatizing happening at that time, as much as there was that traumatizing tone happening then, and it's happening now, but because of different technology and social media, I'll just put the blame on that. It's made everything louder, and maybe for good, but maybe there's good that it's getting everybody's attention in a way. It's that aspect that maybe the negative, it's the way we relate to the negative is what we need to change, not trying to over control it. How are we relating to the negative? That's very real, that's showing up in this moment in time. But I was listening to you, I'm going, yeah, your words could have been, to me, applied when I was living through the 60s of watching Black people being hosed down in civil rights, on a black and white TV, or dealing with all kinds of issues through the 60s of having drug addicted people, my brother and stuff. And now we have opioid crisis, so.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind for me is intensification.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, like, I see these as waves, almost like in time. The 60s is like one intensification, and then you have this, this other noise, and then there's another intensification. But I don't know. That's a bit abstract. That's all. I just wanted to say that's what comes to mind.
But I'm glad you brought up intensification, because that was what I was leaving out. For me, it's been turning towards the intensity of the changes that we're living through now, because actually the species have been moving through these intense waves, from what I understand, and we kind of we're lacking an ability to actually ride the wave, I guess, that we're in. I don't know.
Hopefully we're learning the ability.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, guys? Can you hear me?
Yeah, John.
Good. I was having trouble with my sound system. I want to respond briefly to that. I hope Ed will join in, because I think the Axial Age is something that Ed and Michael and myself and TJ, I think we have one more member who are studying together that book, and how it interfaces perhaps with Gebser is of interest to many of us. But I just wanted to put a question mark about the Axial Age and what that was around 500 BC that was happening. And I think there's no big consensus, but I think a part of it was that big cities were happening, and there were still lots of nomadic peoples moving around. But the trend was towards cities and agriculture and hierarchies and kings and queens and high priests. And there were some people who rebelled against that, and they went to the forest, they went to the desert, they went to the jungle, and they created sometimes monastic orders. Sometimes there was a shamanic hangover that they were incorporating, but they were going from one kind of intensity, which they did not like, to another kind of intensity, which was sitting still for many hours, watching thoughts and feelings, and connecting to that witness. And they also had all kinds of practices, very elaborate ones, which we can all work with even today. They're very, very effective. But I think that was a different kind of intensity they were working with, sitting in those caves and meditating for hours. But I think it encouraged a reflexive turn. And that's when there was a capacity to step outside of that system and reflect upon your participation in the system. So there was a kind of witnessing capacity that started to kick in. And I think a new axial age is what I'm interested in, is what in the world would that be like if we could take these contemplative capacities and carry forward that contemplative capacity, that self-reflexive turn, that ability to witness and to participate more effectively, rather than just transcend. I think the encouragement there to transcend is very strong in those in that first axial age, and drop everything else. And I think that whole tension between transcendence and immanence, we act that out in many different ways. And I think sometimes we go shopping, we do drugs, we have sex with strangers, we do anything we can to alleviate this tension. And I think we're learning that those don't work. And I think that's what a lot of what happened in the 60s. And I believe that we're trying to deal with that disconnect between those very real transcendent realms. They're real, and our immanent capacities as very limited individuals in certain networks that support us or do not support us. How do we make that happen? Anyway, I'm just sharing that as a big question mark.
John, I agree with your articulation, because I think what the new layer from my experience, exactly what you're saying, is it's more now, at least the people I'm studying, like Reggie Ray and stuff, it's the oscillation that's become more important with the tension, rather than either, especially, and I take your point of trying to transcend and not participate in the world. No, you need to transcend and look at your participation and how you can better be in the world. So I get the sense that what's coming online is recognizing this oscillation practice, that we need to oscillate between kind of, as Van Morrison sings, retreat and view, and then go back in. Sometimes we have to retreat. It's not to escape, it's just, like you said, to step back. And and there's a lot of challenge right now with people, especially when you bring in trauma work, that the best way to heal trauma is to kind of practice the witnessing, but ever so slowly go back in, bring it back in, not just to try to use witnessing and those meditative practices to deny and try to eliminate the intensity of the tension of your trauma, because that will not fucking work. It will cause more problems.
I'd love to chime in at this time. I think, Michael, your point about the oscillation is really strong, because in many ways, everything about what makes life vibrant is about the movement triggered by tensions. You can't have just an awareness of differentiation. You also need an awareness of holism or of oneness. You can't have, and that is what makes things healthy, I think, is the dynamic movements. But additionally, when it comes to the question of what do we carry forward, I want to expand on what John was saying about the, diversity of internal cultures and mental and practices, and different, how different cultures emphasize developing different capabilities in human beings. I think that we need to also be aware, when we talk about what we bring forward, which capacities of the fairly complex and capacious human mind do we develop on purpose? Because I do get the sense that there's been, as growing up as an American, there's been a sense that, at least in my family and in my school and in my, that my direct experiences, there's been a sense that we don't really take a lot of responsibility for our culture. We kind of just assume that you're born into it and shit's gonna happen to you, and that's just the way it is. There's no meta awareness of the cultural frame. It's just you're gonna go through experiences. There's no, and so, but what if we could take a kind of meta sense of responsibility for the culture itself, and what kinds of consciousnesses we are developing through which kinds of containers, which kinds of experiences. There is a lot of trauma that I see Americans as children experiencing that never gets processed, because there's no acknowledgement that there would need to be such processing. There's no, so anyway, I just think about I think there's a lot of ways that, you know, we can train ourselves to be more in communion, like able to communicate more profoundly and richly with non-human beings. Ways that we can tap into and then be able to integrate and integrate and make sense of in a unified order, like altered states of consciousness. I think there's a lot of capacities that make humans incredibly capable and potent, but which capacities? Because the ways that we are conditioning ourselves will be reflected in our actions and our interpretations in the world going forward. And so what we take with us is not just outside of us. It's also a question of what we take with us that's embodied, and what potentials that are embodied are getting amplified or emphasized, and which potentials that may have been imprinted into us do we de-emphasize consciously, effortfully. You know.
I think for me, I'm going to bring up a critical point with all this for me, and I'm going to use some symbology because it's relevant. It speaks to me. Within the Christian tradition, they talk about everybody's got to carry their own cross. And what I feel that symbolism represents, that as much as we are talking about practices and how each one of us can be better informed and relate and at least not contribute to the ongoing traumatization, the carry your own cross is you do the best you can, but you have no fucking control of the results. You don't have control of the results. You have attention to your inner experience as you're living it, and it's going outside. But it's challenging this mental or this deficient rational of being obsessed with doing these practices and being in control and predicting everything, because that is going to trip us up if we don't challenge how we use. I'm not saying it's potent and it can't be used, but the obsession of how it defines how we are in the world needs to fucking go away, in my opinion, because I didn't get better until I stopped trying to control and predict how I was going to get better, if that makes sense.
Yes, Michael, thank you. And oscillation and moving from transcendent to immanent and the zones in between. It's not an either or, it's a both and it's a neither nor. How we use our language is going to be really crucial, I think. But I hope I don't lose my train of thought. And which capacities do we carry forward? And which may we want to drop? Like sexism, homophobia, racism. I'm all for dropping that. And I think capitalism is something we need to drop as well, from my partial perspective. But there's something else. Oh yes, predict and control may come from the deficient rational, and we all have had the experience of that, because we're educated in certain ways to, you don't get a GED or a diploma if you aren't able to do that to some limited extent to demonstrate that you can. And that's where I think I would just add on to predict and control may not be something we want to carry forward, but we definitely want to use influence and stop pretending that you don't influence the situation you're in. Otherwise, you just become a perpetual victim of other people's nefarious actions. And I think you need to have to say, wait, stop. I'm not in control. You're not in control. You have an influence and I have an influence. And then let's be responsible, right? Okay. And I haven't heard from Ed yet. I'm sure there's something he would like to contribute. Thank you.
I actually don't have a lot to say. We talked about something obviously happened around 500 BC. And the world wasn't the same afterwards as before. But in all of the reading that I've done in our group, of course, and all the talk that we've done about it, I don't think we can point to, well, what made it happen? Why did it happen? How did it come about? It certainly wasn't we humans consciously doing anything. That was probably the least of us. We're trying to figure out what that is afterwards. In the 60s, this is Michael's example. Something happened. There was a shift of sorts that took place. Who caused it? What caused it? How did it come about? Were we responsible for that? I don't think so. I don't think we humans consciously did anything. Because this is the curmudgeonly side coming out now, I don't think we as humans are very smart and very capable of learning. I grew up in a Cold War situation that went away, and it's back. What did we learn? Obviously, nothing. We haven't taken anything with us because we're going through the same shit. It's all happening again because we actually don't do anything. We talk a lot. We reflect a lot. I think that's good. I'm glad that we all think very hard about these things, but how many of us are there who are doing this? How many people in your immediate environment are going to respond to you handing them a Haraway's book and say, you got to read this, it's going to change your life? I can tell you that in my environment where I am in rural Germany, even if it were translated, no one. Because most of them don't read books. Most of them work from the time they get up to the time they go to bed. And they celebrate their festivals when they fall as much as they can. But they don't sit and reflect deeply on what it is that I'm going to do with my life and how is it that I'm going to prevent the next cataclysm that looks like it's impinging upon me. Most of them don't even recognize that there's a global warming problem. Because where did they get their information? Do they read the scientific reports? I don't think so. They get it on the 8 o'clock news. And the 8 o'clock news gives them a picture that they have in their lives. So, you know, we're in a very privileged and select group that could perhaps have some effect, but I'm less than optimistic that our individual efforts are going to do something. Something collective has to happen. So on the one hand, I think there's a collective action that needs to take place. And on the other hand, some things are going to happen in spite of everything that we do. And we never think about those things. And those things that happen in spite of what we do have something to do with what happened in 500 BC, what happened in the 60s, and what may be happening now. Because I also do think there's a lot of potential for shifts, changes. Most of them, I agree with Marco, trauma plays a huge role in this. And they're going to be traumatic changes. That's why I'm not a big Haraway fan, and I don't think that her vision of the future is absolutely the best one, but I think I understand why she thinks that way. I think I understand why it looks like that's the more probable at the time. Maybe she wants to encourage us to do whatever we could to perhaps change that. But if I just look around me in my everyday environment, it's going to look more like Haraway's or some of the other naysayers than some kind of rosy future that's going to come about. Because I don't think human beings, for the most part, will react unless they are being invaded, Caroline. They have, and there's a saying in German, I have to say, pack deine 7 Sachen und hau ab. And it's literally pack your 7 things and go. Because at the time, when they were getting invaded, they didn't have more than 7 things. So there was not a lot of decision making, and you could put it all in a little bag and carry it with you. And everybody got to carry their own 7 things. And that's the whole, and which is why I liked the analogy that you're building, because you've got a little parcel. It's a hobo sack, and there's 7 things. But for most people, if they own 7, they were probably lucky. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
I
need a U-Haul just for my books.
You got to keep them up here. No. I want to just quickly make a reflection on what you were saying, Ed, about not seeing the conditions to be able to respond to this moment adequately around you and in the populace. And I notice in general a connection between comfort, material, social comfort, and stability, and being willing and maybe even prone to accepting partial narratives of what's going on beyond your little bubble. I actually think that, you know, we've been receiving feedback, ecological feedback, about how things are not going well for many decades at least. But only until it has become so gross, so obvious, so universal, literally, that we can't deny it anymore, do we have a chance of actually experiencing the disruption.
My point is, it can still be denied, and it is being denied. It's not as universal as you like to think.
Well,
the people around me here don't see it as cataclysmic as you do.
Sure. So what I'm trying to get at here is only when the feedback is so gross can it break through mental locks that have been put on us by dominant forces, by the elite, the status quo, the, you know, governments, corporations who have their own interests to protect, by promoting narratives consistent with themselves. And that's been going on since at least World War I or II, right? So we have been in bubbles that we've been content to be in because it happens to privilege us personally. We're comfortable enough by the way, you know, things are. Like, we are all privileged enough to have whatever, food and homes and things like that. So we tend to, but when disruption happens, which it will, because you can deny, but only to a certain extent. That's the fun thing about this moment, is like, when will it break down enough that it's pervasive, the sense that something needs to change? And it's starting to happen now, as you point out, Ed. And so when there's disruption, if you are an ecologist or a permaculturist, you you have to notice that disruptions are always opportunities at the same time. The problem is the solution. The breakdown in meaning is opportunity for new meaning constructs, new stories, to actually emerge in the place of the old, no longer adequate meanings. Just like words evolve, just like language and theories evolve, you know, we need to evolve, and that's very, very apparent. And again, like, when the feedback is you know, minor, it's tapping at you, you can just brush it off. Oh, you know, whatever, that's a fluke. But when it starts to get more and more and more dominant to your senses, eventually we're going to have to be forced to try to integrate the lessons from why our behaviors have caused this feedback ecologically, right? And we may die, we may all become extinct in the process, but I have a lot of hope in the power of learning and of integration. Going back to this thread of trauma, that there is a way through trauma to transform the energy inherent in the contact that was traumatic. And so I think we can actually take our entire histories, potentially, and really make sense of what, like, of what wrong orientations or wrong ways of relating caused our situation now. And so it's a huge opportunity, I think, to liberate into a more like blissful, relational, skillful future than, you know, a denial-based present. So, yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. I'd also like to respond to Ed's litany, or maybe eulogy, I'm not sure. But there's, the claim that he's making is that there's no one in his environment that is thinking like we are, that's reflecting and struggling and perhaps making a transition from a first order to a second order culture. And I know, Ed, we've had many discussions about what second order culture is. And we've had some embodied experiences of that. I think you mentioned in one area, in one part of your neighborhood, they have strudel with applesauce on it. And then on the other side on another town, they don't do that practice, and they don't know what you're talking about when they ask for applesauce your strudel. So there's a difference. There's a culture gap even between one town and the next in the same country. I just wanted to add something though. You had some beliefs. They sounded like limiting beliefs to me. If I had to add that belief, I would feel extremely limited. That doesn't mean they're limiting beliefs for you, but they are beliefs. Human beings, there's no change unless human beings are invaded. And I guess the question I have, and I had many questions, and this isn't necessarily for you particularly, but for all of us. And I'm also wanting to blend the cognitive and the affective and the somatic. So when you say there's no one in your environment that is going to make a difference, that's not exactly what you said, but I think there's a conclusion I can make from listening to your limited beliefs being explored here, which I applaud you for putting them on the table, because we all have them. And what we do when we're aware of them is a lot of, I believe, what a second order, perhaps a new axial age would be about. And how can we be with others who may be in a first order relationship to the environment when we have a second order relationship to their relationship to the environment? How can we share our observations with those who are in a first order relationship with their environment in a way that they can hear and in a way that they can actually make use of? I think that's where the humanities and the sciences, which are right now in great stress because they're not listening to each other very much, I think this is where we can actually make a difference, that can make a difference. And that doesn't mean we have to drop our humanism. I think we can be variations on post-humanism, some kind of transhumanism. I'm all for exploring how that could be different for each person. But your environment, Ed, and your grandson, that beautiful little boy you've told us so many stories about. And when you walk across that track with him, that railroad track, and you caution him about looking both ways, and he says, why? I don't know what he calls you. Does he call you grandpa? At any rate, you say your life depends on it. And when you told me that anecdote, and then I hear you tell me human beings need to be invaded. And when that belief, human beings need to be invaded, what do you want to have happen to your grandson?
Just to clarify, John, it is a belief. I agree with you 100%. It is a limiting belief. I agree with you 150% on that one. No problem whatsoever. It's not that humans have to be invaded. It's just, it has to get so bad that they have no choice. It's this overwhelmingness. Now, I do, in my own limited curmudgeon-y way, try to instill in my grandson something of Carolyn's optimism so that he thinks there's still a chance. He needs to grow up thinking there's a chance. I think there's a chance, but I don't think that we as a species are smart enough to consciously move in a direction that is to our own benefit. That's another limited belief that I have. You see, I understand that they are limited. I agree with you. I don't mind that being pointed out whatsoever. But I don't see the historical evidence anywhere so far. Maybe something's changed. Maybe that's what's really different about this time around, that we're smart enough to do it. I just don't believe it yet, and I don't see the evidence out there that encourages me to say, okay, well, maybe you want to give that one up. So I'm going to hold on to it for a little while and see how things develop. But I personally think it's going to have to get a whole lot worse before it gets better, which is also a homeopathic principle. You know, it's got to get worse before it gets better. It gets darker before the dawn. You know, we have all kinds of ways that we talk about that because I think that's part of our experience. Now, on top of all of that, I would love to have people come up to me and say, "I told you you were full of shit." Wouldn't bother me a bit. Wouldn't be the first time in my life. Wouldn't be the first time I had to eat crow. That would be okay too. Okay, but until I start seeing the evidence, I'm going to just sit here with my little curmudgeon. I don't think we're smart enough to do it. I would like to think that we could, but I don't think that we can. All right, but I obviously show up here on Tuesday nights to talk with you folks about this kind of stuff, hoping all the while that I'll find some kind of inspiration so that I can talk to the people in my environment, the people that are around me in this rural community, to make them aware of things that they otherwise aren't aware of. And that is one thing I have to say. It's no criticism of this group itself, but Haraway doesn't help me there at all. She gives me actually no practical, hands-on, here's a little, how do you take this screwdriver with you the next time you want to, loosen one of those screws. Nah, that's not there. Connolly had a little bit more of that. For example, when we read him, that was, with his multi-regional accumulated, whatever that hell it was. He had this strange concept. I can't remember, but it was an idea of odd folks getting together to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. And I'm going, okay, well, I can do something with that. All right. And so there was a little, that tool-like thing that was in there. And I'm missing that here, but that doesn't mean that it's a nice read, she brings in a lot of that literary kind of things into a text that you wouldn't expect it in. I think that's fine, but I'm not as inspired as the rest of you are. But that's
and Ed, you said that there's a chance, maybe a chance for your grandson, but you don't believe that there's anything for our species. But there may be a chance for your grandson. And Caroline's optimism. And you keep showing up here to find some inspiration so that you can make others aware. And there's a question, I don't know what the most useful question I could ask would be, and it isn't necessarily just about you, although you're the person I'm addressing right now. I think we all have limiting beliefs. And from your description of your limiting belief isn't that limiting. It actually creates conditions for something different to happen. And it has to get really, 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 really bad before people are going to make a change. So it's a limiting belief that is at the edge of something that is less limited. So I think they were in these transitions, many of us, between these beliefs that are rigidly held, that dominate our lives, that dominate the lives of others because we hold them and we make them our new reality, their reality as well. So I'm very aware I have limiting beliefs. And I can be very, very pessimistic and even despairing, but I also know the polar bears, I'm not going to do them much good if I end up in a corner of my bedroom in a fetal position crying all day. I'm not going to be in my cognitive capacities are going to be diminished considerably. I think there are good tears. I think I have them often. I tear up a little bit. Sometimes they spill down my cheeks and last for a few minutes, maybe even a few seconds. And then my body feels real good afterwards. So there are good tears. And then there are the tears that are not so good, where you're howling in a corner and you need some sort of someone else to take control because your life is falling apart. Now, I think some of us oscillate quite a bit from these extremes. But I'm just sharing this with you because you're very dear to me. I've never met you in person, but I like your curmudgeonly outlook. I like that you can be very grumpy when many of us are very optimistic. And I can be grumpy too. And I think I've displayed that on more than one occasion, these events. So I just, but I think there's an antidote to despair. I don't know which poet said it. The antidote to despair, or the antidote to suffering, is beauty. And if you can just gather a little bit of beauty each day, just with your holding your grandson's hand and cautioning him over that railroad track, you know, I think we can communicate more effectively what our deepest aspirations actually are, rather than say, oh, well, these are the deepest aspirations I have, but I'm not going to share that with you because I don't believe that they can ever be manifested. I think that's a deep trap that we can all put ourselves in. And I say personally, the gay movement didn't happen because we thought it would happen. We did it anyway. There was all the evidence in the world, from church, state, pharmacology, medical establishment, that nothing was going to change. There was no reason for us to think that it would, but it did change because we used our imaginations, not in a Pollyanna fashion. We knew what we were up against, but we weren't letting anybody else define what our reality was.
That's correct. May I just add one thing? Because I agree with you, in the corner of your room in the fetal position, that's where you were not. That's where I am not, but that's where I don't see many people at all. There is not enough action. There's a whole lot of talk, but there's not enough action. And I'm a little sad that there isn't more. Like you, I have no problems with going out, getting in the street, getting my head hit. That's not the point, you say. But you have to get up off your ass and do something. Not just talk, do. And I don't see enough action right now. And I agree with everything else that you said, John.
I really want to follow up on that, if that's possible. I really agree with the sentiment that talk that does not turn into action is a little bit of a toxicity. It's like a little bit of pollution or something. Like, it's not moving us forward, and it needs to be. Talk needs to turn into action. But I also think that there's some grappling going on right now with action that is appropriate, action that takes the right scale, the right strategy. Because I think, you know, you can just get out in the street and hold a sign, but as we've seen, that no longer moves societies anymore. The system that keeps things under control, so to speak, has evolved beyond that and can manage democracy now instead of actually engaging with it, right? So there is still a concern of evolution and of the how when we ask ourselves, what do we do now? What do we do now? And I think coming back to the theme that John raised about influence is really critical, because there is no limit to our influences and how a single moment of contact and influence can ripple. So you in your neighborhood, just talking about it, just being the weirdo who talks about it is still going to be influencing people, because you're bringing that perspective to that space. And this will be my last comment in here, because I know I've taken up a fair amount of space and I want to obviously make sure there's enough space for everybody. But I wrote this morning when I was reflecting on reading the introduction to this topical text, right? About cosmos too, and it all has these themes in it. It says, my dream for cosmos is that we are rigorous enough in our efforts to be with, entangled, influenced by each other, transformed rapidly in place through these contacts, just as the author seems to advocate, and that we recognize the temptations in those attracted to philosophical life to stay in the mind. Staying in the mind was only possible when we had the illusion of material comfort and stability. We don't anymore. Or rather, more accurately, we no longer can afford to harbor that illusion. It's always been an illusion, but you know, for a time we could afford the illusion. The illusion that our presences don't impact, don't influence. I want folks coming into Cosmos to be consistently met with the expectation that they do influence, that they participate, that their influence matters, is felt, is seen, is regarded, is digested, and that we interact, we combine, we co-produce, we commingle, and that this is the ultimate expression of our praxis. It conveys that we are cognizing beings, whole beings. We have bodies, we have minds, we have lives, we have experiences, and we need to bring all of that into our influences that we choose to select for in these conversations, and into our models for who we are and how we are. And that, through these contacts, we grow more and more spacious, right? More and more imaginative.
I think
So,
it's how we model and how we meta-model, how we look at all of these different models, and where does this model come from? Does this model have a size or a shape? What happens next? And how does that compare, contrast with this other model? And then can we bring this element and this element together in a different kind of model? And I think the more we can do this, the more we're modeling complexity rather than dysfunction, and re-embodying the dysfunction of the well-meaning, perhaps, teachers and parents that we had. God bless them.
so a couple things I wanted to speak to is one, Ed's notion of evidence, which I don't disagree with, but I think his curmudgeonly I'm going to challenge, because I've always liked the phrase, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's an important balance point with what he's saying. Two, also I'm picking on Ed, is this notion that there's too much talk and not enough action. Again, I take partially his point, but it goes to what Carolyn was pointing out. If it's conversation with not followed up with action, yeah, it's bullshit. But it's the act of being willing to converse like we're doing here that is helped me act better in the world. The act of conversing with you guys, listening to you guys, has contributed to me going out on the street, meeting with people that 5 years ago, I would have had a defensive reaction because they're so stupid, Instead of, okay, back down, Mike, try to listen non-defensively, even though you disagree with them. Try to actually initiate a conversation, not go to war in conversation. And that's a skill set. And that's why I think I'm trying to bring to the table, conversation may be the first act we need to really take seriously and skillfully, and know that, like any skill, it can be deficient if you're not following through. I have major problems with some of people in my life that will say one thing and do another thing. And depending on the day and moment of my my trauma response, I may say, what the fuck were you doing? Why don't you just say what you meant to say? Do what you say you're gonna do. Don't give me this bullshit, of telling me one thing and you don't even follow through. So I'm just trying to be oscillating between positive and what the fuck is going on here, if that makes sense.
Can I just jump in with something that's I'm not sure it's entirely directly relevant, but it's something I've been thinking about while people have been talking, and I've just been listening for a while because I'm not familiar with this idea of the axial age, and although I've been looking it up while you've been talking, but it just made me, the discussions about sort of trauma and I'm not sure if someone said agency, but these sorts of influence, stuff like that. It made me think about mindfulness and the critique of mindfulness as this like returning of the responsibility for your trauma or your stress, particularly back to the sufferer. So anything that ails you in terms of mental health is the cause or the fault even lies within you, and that the way to be released from this is to engage in this extremely individualist secular spirituality which has been, which mindfulness is promoted as mindfulness, and and how this has been kind of, obviously it takes lots of many of its cues from Buddhist thought and Buddhist practice, but it's emptied it out of all the kind of the ethical and sort of wider community-based understandings of it as a practice. And it's been instrumentalized by neoliberalism as this way of not recognizing, it's been instrumentalized by neoliberalism as a way of making you a efficient worker or efficient subject, maybe in capitalism, by sort of fixing the things which are wrong with you, which are caused by capitalism largely, or neoliberalism, which denies the individual circumstances of each person. So it denies that that stress and anxiety and trauma are not just in your head. It denies that they are they actually exist from social, political circumstances which are actually out of your control. So mindfulness is not the fix-all that it's sort of promoted to be, even though in itself it's not a bad thing. I'm not sort of saying that people shouldn't do it, but this idea that stress in the workplace can just be fixed by mindfulness, by not instead of actually improving people's working conditions, we'll just give them an MP3 of some mindfulness exercises and they can just get on with it and be a better subject. And so I was just thinking about how that is a kind of trajectory for dealing with the conditions of society, contemporary society in the Western kind of capitalist society, and how it seems timely to be looking at things like Haraway and other kind of writings on new materialism and even and object-oriented ontology to some extent, thinking about the ways in which we need to get away from this individualist, going back to what I was originally saying about sort of that sovereign bounded self, this kind of, need to get away from this sense that everything comes from the everything that ails you is a product of the shit going on in your head, which some of it is, but mostly it's to do with conditions and circumstance and the regimes in which we all live under. So sort of thinking about what we take forward, I guess, is a kind of a recognition that community and collaboration, whether interpersonal, interhuman, or interspecies, or anything like this, these things are the only way in which things are going to get better. And this is kind of like a return to previous ways of being. We've all just become this hyper individual selves. So and this is kind of what the thing that I feel most strongly comes from Haraway's writing and lots of other places, but yeah, sorry, that wasn't entirely in response to anything, any one thing that people had said, but it was just something it made me kind of think on and free associate with a bit. So I'm sorry if that changed the tack a bit, like near the end, but maybe that's useful.
I would like to respond to that and pick up on that, if I may, because I think it comes back to the question, like, who are we? Are we disembodied pure consciousnesses that are somewhere floating in nowhere, that give controls and to our, to our physical beings to do things like, and there's a whole ontology, right, that is behind it, and it's reinforced through our institutions, through the ways we talk, and and through our culture. And I think that part of what we are doing here right now amongst us, and more generally the we's that reflect on those things, is rethinking that and trying to think things differently and trying to make spaces in our thought for different possibilities. So for me, I love mindfulness, but I don't want to pay money to be mindful. I don't want to buy anybody's mindfulness, because that's just a ridiculous kind of side effect or epiphenomenon of this particular techno-economic mode that we're in. However, I totally recognize the value of witnessing awareness and of thinking before you speak and things like all the various. Not always. I obviously don't always think before I speak. Otherwise, I'd get into a lot less trouble. But anyway, I appreciate you saying that, because part of what I think Haraway is all about really is like taking us out of the isolated individual, the like atomic individual. And the atomic individual and atomic thinking has been useful. It has allowed for a lot of useful predict and control. I like that if I get in a plane, it can be predicted and controlled that it will land at the destination that was, ascribed to it, and safely, and so forth. So there's a lot of, I think, benefit to mental mental abstraction. When we talk about humanity or the species, we're still in the realm of abstraction, I think. Whereas when we are in our relationships now, like in this community of discourse that we have here between us, I think we actually have power, and we are influential, and our influence can grow. And we don't want, it doesn't have to grow to abstract universal proportions. It has to just be enough for me to get us through, like to get myself through, or to get ourselves through to what it is that we desire. And so articulating what it is that we desire, what our aspirations are, what do we want to have happen, and then also taking the mental view and saying, well, is that realistic? And maybe it's not realistic, but we do it anyway because that, the desire trumps whatever perceived limitations there are. But I think that we have a kind of opportunity to bring together a lot of different practices, and to find the places where like our individualistic desires start to merge and fuse with like what is it that we can do together, and what do we want to, for us, and that us being a large porous us, but not necessarily a universal absolute us. I think that one piece of it, just to connect with another thread of conversation here, the quantum that has been going on, is that I'm coming to these kind of some personal theories that I'm rehearsing. So thanks, being trauma. The other one is around like wave and particle, and this sense that they're a duality, and it's really one or the other. I think it's actually wave. I think that waves are more real than particles. I think particles are mental abstractions, and the wave thing is actually real, and that we are more waves than we are particles. So we are more fields we make vibrations. We oscillate and we vibrate, and that our vibrations interfere with each other and can amplify if they're in sync, or can cancel if they're opposite, or can just create noise if they're not in sync. And so who we are is like these intensities, within fields that are completely dynamic, completely alive, completely like open. And so if we act that way, rather than act as if we're individualized particles existing nowhere, just happening, to control these limbs and things, and if we act more like we're waves than we're particles, I think we'll be able to get more in tune. We'll be able to attune with each other, with our environments, with Gaia or Cthulhu, and so I would like to ask, since we're kind of near the end of this session, what is our intentions with this book? And Haraway has been around for a while. She's come up a number of times. We've made gestures towards reading her. In this session, I think the only quasi-required reading was the introduction. Is there a desire to read the rest of the book? Is there a desire to stay with the text and the trouble of reading the text? I would like to. I think it's probably around time, but I'd like to find a way to do that fits with the overall, cosmic kind of context.
I would like to respond to that with a story, and I sort of hesitate to do this because if you're a storyteller, please tell your story if it has some use for the group, because we can all tell stories that have no relevance whatsoever to anything. So I think this is the challenge for me, especially. Also, I often try to build. I'm using Nora Bateson's idea. We're here to catch a rhythm rather than to crack a code. So sometimes my intention is to build on what other people are saying, although it sometimes comes across as if I'm interrupting them. So I apologize ahead of time if I've interrupted anybody. But I'm actually trying to build upon something that you're saying to create momentum, which would be easy to do if we were all in the same room together. But it's, for me, very challenging to do in this particular environment that we're in. I find it extremely clunky compared to the old-fashioned way of getting together with somebody in the same room, sharing the same temperature, breathing the same air, having an environment that you share. I don't know what the environment is that we share right now. But anyway, having said all that, and in the interest of promoting a polyphasic culture, where other phases of consciousness can be allowed, I had a dream last night. Right before bed, I was listening to a scholar talk about Buddhism and a belief in the shamanic traditions from which Buddhism emerged, and that there was a belief, a widely held belief among some of these early practitioners, that there were other entities that were on other levels that were more advanced than humans, but that some of these entities were crazier than humans are. So, there are a lot of cautionary tales about be very careful about when you meet the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha, because someone can identify themselves as the Buddha and they could be totally crazy. At any rate, taking that all in, I went to sleep, and I was awakened in the middle of the night by a mosquito. And to me, that's the most hell-inducing experience there is, to be in the room with a mosquito that won't let, and when you're very sleepy. But anyway, I put on some socks and I put on a different shirt. And I put on some spray, and I went back to sleep, and I had a dream. And in the dream, I was in a space with two entities. They both were humanoid, male. I sensed that they were both gay. One was sort of a quiet kind of guy, extremely attentive and paying attention. The other guy was a sorcerer, very dark energy, vampiric, real creepy guy, but I could tell he was very powerful. And we were in an enclosed space, sort of like I didn't know exactly where the beginning and the ending of the space was, but it felt enclosed. And I wanted, first of all, to get out of there, but on another level, I thought, no, deal with this. And I did. So I said to this sorcerer, you know, I didn't say this, I intended it. It's very nonverbal communication. Give me your best shot. Give me the worst. And I could tell him, he puffed up, you know, and he communicated to me like a bolt of energy. And rather than to defend myself, I absorbed it. And I took in and registered the toxicity of it. And that also, I registered that I could modify it. And I sent that back to him. And I could feel this, he sensed what I sensed and that I had added something else. And he had to deal with that. And I could tell that he was modifying his behavior towards me and his communiques. And I would, by the way, this is all very nonverbal and it's all very energetic, but to me, it's extremely real, more real than what's happening in the streets of Manhattan, people walking around with their smartphones. At any rate, I'm just sharing that with you because I think, was it the mosquito that bit me, that irritated me, that came back in the dream as this strange alien other? Is it the forest? Is it the fires that are happening currently in the Amazon? The world is, I believe, this is a negative belief in some ways, made by a trickster. But I believe this trickster can trick us in ways that are very creative if we allow ourselves to get off center and then return to center quickly, and then communicate what we've learned. So hopefully completing some distinctions would be, I think, something that would be very useful for all of us. And I hope we do more of that here. And we have been doing it more. I think the more feedback we give to one another, the better. And I'm all for studying Donna Haraway, and I would love to do a contrast compare between Donna Haraway and Nora Bateson and Gregory Bateson, whom we've already studied. There are 20 videos out there if anyone wants to look. Lucy appeared in many of them. So anyway, I'm just sharing that with you guys. What happens next is up to us, I guess. Thank you very much for this very enjoyable afternoon. Thank you.
I'm up to working with staying with the trouble, but only because I like the title, nothing else. I just like the title.
I would love to be in a book group doing this book. It's very relevant. It's a relevant, timely read for me with what I'm writing. So I feel motivated to do that and stick with it. There's been a lot of books that y'all have read that I have missed out on. It makes me sad. I mean, I can watch your conversations, but I can't, it's not fresh, you know, I can't participate. So for this one, I would be happy to participate. And I would also make an effort to recruit some friends of mine who I know personally who would also be very interested. It's just, they're not maybe as integrated with Cosmos yet. So I don't know about timeline, but I will say that September and October are somewhat spacious, and November and December are entirely spacious. I have no idea what I'm going to do for work or any of this. So yeah, so I feel like this coming season is a good one for me to be more engaged on the cultural activities.
Yeah, I'd be up for doing a more kind of close reading of the remainder, well, the majority of the book, in a group scenario. So yeah, count me in.
Just wanted to add that John, you'd make a good Gnostic, and Marco, Neoplatonism suits you well. So, but as far as the book itself is concerned, I doubt that I would be participating in a deeper read.
So why don't we at least Caroline, Lucy, John, Michael, maybe we could get organized, find a time. Let's try to be conscientious about how we do this, and see if we can start to build. This ties into other conversations that we've been having around how we do things in Cosmos, how we can make it easier. And I think every book is an opportunity to revisit that and to improve a little bit. So why don't we get our minds together offline and think about timing, space, and the kind of space that we want to create for the conversations that we could have, and how to welcome other people in. Caroline, your friends, like, who would not, really, for whom maybe some references might not resonate. Like if I say Axial Age, they'd be like, they just haven't been part of that conversation. So how do we make those bridges, or those kinds of, how do we carry the meaning across? I'd love to do that. So, and I'll think about the Neoplatonism a bit. I think Plato has gotten a bad rap, actually. So I don't take that. I take that hopefully with the generous spirit in which it was offered or intended.
Oh, it was very generous. I can tell you that. 7 Hermetic axioms are all Neoplatonism. The third one is all is vibration. It's it just, what you were saying, just it fit in so well with that. The all is mind, and there's these polarities, but that everything is vibration. Everything is vibration. It's a wonderful place to start. Whereas we like to say, when I was in California, it's all about the vibes. And it really is all about the vibes. I mean,
hang 10.
I feel you. I feel you.
Right, Michael?
Hang 10. Hang 10. Just get out in the water. Get out in the water. You can use your body. You can use a surfboard. You can use a boogie board. Use your body. Surf the wave with your body. You're not.
That's a great. And I think that's an analogy. I think we can use.
Yeah, your body is what, 75% water. So being out in a wave and finding that unique wave that Marco wants to contribute to, and every wave is unique.
Get some string and learn how to do a cat's cradle. I found a YouTube, and I'm going to do this, seriously. If I could find a friend who would play with me, I would be great, but that's sort of hard to set up here.
Have you read Vonnegut's book too, John?
You what?
Have you read Vonnegut? Cat Cradle?
Oh yeah, he wrote a novel.
Yes, he did. Yeah. It's not to preclude you from doing that. I mean,
speaking of curmudgeons,
do the cradle. That part's the good part. But read the book too.
So it went way off the deep end before I could get my final meta comments in. That's actually thematic, but now I'm like swimming in this chaotic whirlpool. But Marco, to your point of how to integrate new folks, or like what references, how to make it for a comfortable space. I think that speaks to a broader question that I'd love to hear Johnny's perspective on, and also others who've been involved more in the book clubs. If we could glean some meta learning about what makes for a good book club when you have a diverse group of folks who are joining from the get-go. Because I think in my own facilitator experience and dialogic experience, having some like subtle constraints, like having some structures where it's like, let's hear from the new folks first, and then we'll hear from, or whatever that those might look like. I'd be curious if there's conscious, thought put into those kind of structures going into a new initiative like this, if there has been, or if we could learn from past experiences and maybe do a processing about that, and then think about this one, So just a suggestion, kind of, because I think that's really good to be aware of. But yeah, I look forward to whatever's next for this conversation as well.
So why don't we have something like an intending planning session, like sort of, let's dream it up. Let's dream, reflect, what have we learned, what do we want to learn, what might we try, and what are the might be the unique challenges with this particular book or this particular, effort. Let's start there, and then from there we probably have a plan come out of that.
Will that take place through messaging or you're going to post something and then or how do we connect the group we're talking about it?
I have a quick answer, but yeah, go ahead.
What's the best time for everybody? By the way, this is the hardest part, is scheduling.
Yeah.
Lucy is in Dublin or in London. Marcos and Caroline are in Colorado. Michael is in California. I'm in New York. So we're all in different time zones, most of us. So this is the biggest challenge. Once you can get a schedule that works, then I think people will keep to the schedule. But if it's too weird of a time for them, they're going to drop out. And I feel like the dropout rate was really large in the Bateson episode, which disappointed me considerably. But those who did show up, I think, had a very good time. So I think this is a challenge. And Caroline, I'd love to take you up on that because I do think there's a way to start. A clean start is very useful. And I think we started, and we did this with the Axial Age. And I think if you have a strong core at the beginning, I think there's more likelihood of it continuing with a low dropout rate. And as you may be sponsoring a reading group in the future with, what was the name of that? The instinct, something, the patterning instinct. I don't know if you wanted to do that or someone else want to do that. I think that would be a lovely book to explore in the future as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Marco, what do you think? If we made just a group, could we start messaging through the group?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
That's perfect. And we can start a planning thread or time thread. What's the best time?
Yeah.
That's because it's really about setting up some ritual of getting together. For me, if I know when we're going to meet, then I'll do the reading ahead of time, and I'll actually figure out how to make it work. And then it's just showing up and with full openness to whatever it wants to happen, but being prepared. And so let's do that. I'll create the group, invite us in, and take it from there.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Maybe I'm the person on the most dramatically different time zone, but this kind of time suits me really well. So just going to put that out there.
Okay. Good to know.
So.
That's great.
Are there days of the week that?
Not especially, no.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Great.
All right.
This is great.
Thanks a lot, everyone. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good to see you all.